when we first started preparing this book and planning it, I was a bit nervous about the word friendship. I thought, clearly they had a friendly relationship, and clearly they were two big figures. I did wonder about this word friendship. I have to say, without any spoilers of the book, absolutely it was a friendship, and it was acknowledged on both sides as a friendship and a close one. She found him charming. She clearly found that he was somebody that she could talk to, and he was absolutely in love with her.
You may know this, but Winston Churchill and Queen Elizabeth II formed one of the most significant relationships between a British monarch and Prime Minister. The pair first met when Elizabeth was just a child, before Churchill helped guide her through the early years of her reign following the death of her father, King George VI. In his new book, Churchill's Queen, The Remarkable Friendship That Shaped Our Age, the historian Nigel Fletcher explores the personal bond between two towering figures of the 20th century. And Nigel's here to talk about it now. Hello to you.
Good morning.
Well, what a fascinating story, because, of course, Churchill had served sovereigns going back to her great-grandfather, and she'd grown up knowing him as a trusted friend of the family, but he became so much more. Tell us more about the kind of relationship that developed between them.
Well, yes, as you say, he had sort of been connected to the royal family for a very long time. By the time that he met Elizabeth when she was 2 years old in 1928, he was staying at Balmoral as Chancellor of the Exchequer. So he was in high office at the very beginning of her life. So you've got to imagine that as Elizabeth grew up, she saw Churchill as this big national figure, and when she was entering her teenage years and during the Second World War, he was, of course, the great war leader. So I think what's really interesting about their relationship is that just from the very beginning, she knew him as Winston Churchill, the great war leader, and he'd always been there. But he was also a friend of her father. So during the Second World War, George VI and Churchill formed a really close partnership and friendship. So in a way, he was sort of an avuncular figure. He was a close friend of her father. And so when she came to the throne, they began with that sort of relationship where he was somebody she'd known, but not a friend of hers so much as a friend of her father.
And of course, he was the first one to greet her, wasn't he, as she stepped off that plane returning home after being informed of the death of her father.
Yes, indeed. And that image is really striking. And I've been reading royal history and political history sort of since I was a child, and that's an image which has always struck me as really important, because it marks the start of her reign. She's coming down the steps of the plane to sort of take her kingdom, and at the bottom of the steps there is this sort of elderly figure, this great statesman Winston Churchill. And having now researched the book and written it, it really represents two things. Firstly, it's the personal relationship. It's the fact that you've got this young woman in her 20s meeting this Prime Minister who is nearly 80 at this point. And so you've got this extraordinary clash of two generations. But also it's two moments in British history, two eras colliding in the middle of the 20th century. Churchill was a Victorian. He served in the army of Queen Victoria. And of course, Elizabeth has served from 1952 all the way through until 2022. So it's this sort of bridge between the 19th century and the 21st that, as a political historian, I found fascinating. And it's kind of captured in that moment as she comes back to meet Churchill as Queen.
Yeah, absolutely. Nigel, did you feel that Churchill's worldview somehow did shape the young Queen and stay with her throughout her reign?
Yes, this is the question I was particularly interested in exploring, because if there was something that he perhaps helped to imbue in her as Queen, then clearly that influence lasted through the longest reign in British history, through until recent times. And I think there are a few things there. I think his idea that Britain needed to remain a big player in the world, that it needed to continue its relationship with its former empire that he was very attached to, I think that was something that he very much wanted to ensure continued. And with the Commonwealth, Elizabeth, I think, managed to do that in a way that Churchill himself, I don't think, was particularly comfortable with. He wanted to retain the empire and all of the imperial associations that had. Elizabeth had a much more progressive view and a much more modern view of what the Commonwealth should become. But I argue in the book that I think that there was something in the sort of projection of world power, what we now call sort of soft power around the world, that I think Churchill really wanted for Britain. And with Elizabeth's embracing of the Commonwealth, I think that we got that.
Now, obviously, there are the formal government files, but you've also delved into private archives and correspondence and some wonderful informal images from the Churchill family photo albums. Tell us a little bit about those rather personal notes that were sent between the Queen and Churchill. She did look on him as a sort of avuncular uncle, it seems, if you read some of those, doesn't she?
Absolutely. And when we first started preparing this book and planning it, I was a bit nervous about the word friendship. I thought, clearly they had a friendly relationship, and clearly they were two big figures. I did wonder about this word friendship. I have to say, without any spoilers of the book, absolutely it was a friendship, and it was acknowledged on both sides as a friendship and a close one. But as you say, in the archives, there's some fantastic things I've managed to dig out. The letters, some of which have been published before, some of which are in the Churchill archive. Between them, they begin when she was a young princess, when he was Prime Minister during the Second World War, and she writes him these rather touching thank you letters for presents that he gave her. For her 18th birthday, he sent her a signed copy of his Life of Marlborough, which is the book that he wrote about his great ancestor.
4 volumes, wasn't it?
4 volumes of that. And you think, well, what more could an 18-year-old want for her birthday? But she writes this very impeccably polite thank you letter, which it just has an air of those sorts of thank you letters that you have to sort of write to relatives who've sent you perhaps not very appropriate gifts. But you have that wonderful sort of touching correspondence that continues all the way through their lives. We probably haven't seen as much of it as we might in future because, of course, Elizabeth's papers have not yet been released. There's probably more to come, but even on the amount that we have now, it's very clear. They have these private jokes about racing, for example. They were both racehorse owners, and they really bonded over that. And they have these little private jokes, both in their letters and in their telegrams between each other, which are really quite touching. So having sort of gone into it as this kind of political and constitutional historian and looking at the kind of significance of these two great figures, it's the personal that really struck me. The fact that this was genuinely a friendship. She found him charming. She clearly found that he was somebody that she could talk to, and he was absolutely in love with her. I mean, there's no question that he completely sort of fell for her, and in an avuncular sort of familial way, but also he was struck by her sort of glamour and beauty, and that's been acknowledged by his family and friends. So you have this really touching relationship as well that goes alongside this extraordinary political partnership as well.
I wonder how Clemmy felt about all of that.
Well, they often sort of had disagreements. For example, when Elizabeth invited Churchill to go to the races after his stroke in 1953, he was very, very keen to go. He didn't want to let the Queen down, and to go there and then stay with her at Balmoral afterwards. Clemmy was insistent this was too much and said, you really can't risk doing this, but he went anyway.
Now, as you're never supposed to say who your favourite child is, can the Queen give away whether he was her favourite? I mean, other people have said that Harold Wilson was her favourite Prime Minister. What did you find out?
Well, I think we have to take it from Elizabeth's own words. And she wrote Churchill a lovely letter as he retired as Prime Minister. And she said then that, of course, she had full confidence in Anthony Eden. She said, but it would be foolish to suggest that anyone would ever come close to the relationship that she had with her first Prime Minister. So she put it there in her letter to him. And later on, in later life, when people said, who did you most enjoy your audiences with, she sort of said, well, Winston, of course, because it was such fun. So I don't think there's really any question that Churchill was unique in being her favourite Prime Minister. Others may have also become friendly with her as well, but as James Callaghan once said, Prime Ministers and the Queen, they could expect friendliness but not friendship. Mm-hmm. And I think that was true with most of them, but not for Churchill. This was clearly, as the book says, a remarkable friendship. And
she broke with tradition by attending Churchill's state funeral in 1965. How significant was that?
It was very significant. This was a breach of protocol, but also the event itself was extraordinary. A state funeral on that sort of scale for Churchill was always going to be a huge event. But she started planning for it, or started the planning for it, when he was still Prime Minister. When she went away for her long Commonwealth tour, he just had his stroke, and I think she was worried then that she might not see him again. And she left instructions as early as that when he died, that he should have, as she put it, a state funeral befitting his role in history. So it was a very personal tribute from her to ensure that he had that sort of a state funeral. And
just very, very quickly, in a couple of seconds, do you think modern monarchs can learn anything from the way his mother managed her relationship with prime ministers?
I think that one of the interesting points in the book I will just quickly mention is that the King himself also met Churchill at Balmoral a number of times, and there's some photographs of that from the Churchill albums in the book. So I think that when we're looking at the influence of Churchill on the Queen, I think we mustn't forget that the King himself also met and knew Churchill, so perhaps he did learn a thing or two from him then.
Nigel Fletcher, thanks very much. His book, Churchill's Queen, The Remarkable Friendship That Shaped Our Age, is out now. It's available to order at the Times Bookshop, where Times Plus members can, of course, get a 20% discount. Just visit timesbookshop.co.uk.